Miss Marple and the First Sad Christmas in History. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1. Toast Beneath the Kissing Bough. The parish hall of St-Mary-Mead had never looked more festive. Garlands of holly and ivy wound themselves around the windows like green ribbons on a Christmas parcel, while paper chains in red and gold looped from beam to beam in cheerful abandon. The air was thick with the mingled scents of pine, candle wax, and the promising aroma of roast beef that drifted from the kitchen, where preparations for the Christmas Day feast were well underway. Miss Jane-Marple adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene, with the quiet satisfaction of one who had witnessed many such celebrations in her 70-odd years. She sat in her usual chair near the wall, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly complicated cable pattern in soft blue wool. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing of the bustling activity around her. "Jane, do stop that eternal knitting and come admire our kissing bough," called Lady Bantry from across the hall. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in emerald velvet that complemented her still golden hair, was directing the final arrangements with the enthusiasm of a theatrical producer on opening night. Miss Marple obligingly set down her work and approached the centerpiece of the decoration. The kissing bough hung from a stout beam directly over what would soon be the pudding table, and it was indeed a magnificent specimen. Unlike the modest bunches of mistletoe that usually grace such occasions, this year's creation was a proper work of art. A heavy iron ring painted black and polished to a dull shine formed the foundation. From it cascaded trails of holly, thick with berries, interwoven with ivy, and punctuated by rosy apples and bright lemons that caught the light like jewels. At the very center hung a substantial brass candlestick, fitted with a thick church candle that would provide a warm glow throughout the festivities. "Most impressive," murmured Miss Marple, though something in her tone suggested a certain reservation. "Rather heavier than usual, is it not?" "Oh, Archbold insisted on making a proper show of it this year," replied Beatrice Larkin, bustling up with an armful of additional paper chains. Mrs. Larkin was the sort of woman who approached every task with military efficiency, and her role as convener of the Women's Institute had honed her organizational skills to a fine edge. Her graying hair was swept back in a no-nonsense style, and her practical tweeds bore not a single crease despite the morning's exertions. "The old ring was getting rather shabby," she continued, "so we commissioned a new one from the ironworks in Much Benham. Cost us a pretty penny, but one must keep up standards." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze traveling from the bow to the gramophone table that had been positioned somewhat closer to the pudding table than she remembered from previous years. The machine itself was a handsome mahogany model, and beside it sat a neat stack of records that would provide musical accompaniment to the feast. "Atchold certainly seems pleased with the arrangements," observed Lady Bantry, nodding toward the far end of the hall, where their host was holding court near the kitchen doors. Archbold Moresby was indeed a man in his element. As chairman of the Christmas committee, he had thrown himself into the organization of today's celebration with the sort of focused determination that had made him successful in business. He was a sleek man in his mid-50s with carefully barbered hair and a silk waistcoat that spoke of prosperity. His wife Vivian stood beside him, elegant in burgundy wool, though there was something brittle about her smile as she listened to her husband's animated conversation with Mr. Hargrave Graves. The village butcher. Half the roast beef is my own donation, Hargrave Graves was saying with evident pride. He was a broad, genial man, with the powerful hands of one accustomed to physical work, and his face was flushed with pleasure at the acknowledgement of his generosity. Nothing too good for St-Mary-Mead on Christmas Day. Indeed, indeed, replied Moresby, though his tone held a note that might have been condescension. Your contributions to our little community are always noted. Something flickered across Hargrave's face at these words. But before he could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. Beg pardon. Sir, but might I have a word about the bow? Beale, the church gardener, approached with the diffident manner of one accustomed to dealing with his betters. He was a wiry man in his 60s, his hands permanently stained with soil and tar from his work among the tombstones and flower beds. What about it? Asked Moresby, a slight edge creeping into his voice. Well, sir, it's just that when I hung it yesterday evening, it seemed to sit a bit different than it does now. Lower-like. I was wondering if perhaps the rope had stretched overnight. Moresby's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I asked you to adjust it this morning, didn't I? The height needed to be exactly right for the ceremony. Yes, sir, that you did, Beale replied, tugging at his cap. Took it up exactly 2 finger breadths, just as you said. Above the pudding table, precise-like. Miss Marple, who had drifted closer during this exchange, observed the interplay with interest. There was something in Moresby's manner that suggested more than mere attention to decorative detail. She glanced again at the kissing bough, noting its substantial weight and the careful positioning directly above where the Christmas pudding would shortly be displayed. A sharp voice from across the hall interrupted her thoughts. Really, Archbold Moresby, if you're quite finished directing the servants, perhaps we might begin the proceedings? Some of us have other obligations this afternoon. The speaker was Nora Pike, the village postmistress, a precise woman who treated punctuality as a moral virtue. She stood behind a small table near the entrance where a wooden donations box sat alongside the official parish register. Her iron-gray hair was arranged in waves that might have been carved from stone, and her black dress was adorned only by a small silver brooch in the shape of a cross. Of course, Miss Pike, Moresby replied, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would gather around, I believe it's time for our traditional Christmas toast. The assembled villagers moved toward the center of the hall, forming a loose semicircle around the pudding table. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the speaker and the general company, her knitting temporarily forgotten in her lap. Moresby stepped forward, his chest puffed with the importance of the moment. In his hand he held a glass of what appeared to be the Christmas punch, though Miss Marple noticed he'd not yet tasted it. Behind him the kissing bough swayed gently in the warm air rising from the kitchen, its candle flickering but steady. My dear friends, he began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the hall. We gather once again to celebrate the most joyous of seasons. As we look around this hall, decorated by willing hands and generous hearts, we see the very best of what makes St-Mary-Mead the treasure that it is. Beatrice Larkin moved quietly to the gramophone and lifted the needle, preparing to start the first record. The opening strains of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen began to fill the air, providing a festive backdrop to Moresby's words. But let us remember, he continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, that beneath the joy and celebration we have responsibilities to one another. The Christmas fund that many of you have contributed to so generously represents more than mere charity. It represents our commitment to honesty, to fairness, to ensuring that every gift is given and received in the spirit of truth. Miss Marple frowned slightly. There was something ominous in these words, something that spoke of more than holiday sentiment. She glanced around the assembled faces and saw that she was not the only one who had noticed the shift in Moresby's tone. Therefore, Moresby raised his glass higher, and the candlelight from the bough above caught the crystal and threw rainbows across his face. "I propose a toast. May St-Mary-Mead never see the first sad Christmas in history." The gramophone played on, the familiar melody wrapping around the hall like an audible embrace. But even as the villagers raised their glasses in response, Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with growing unease. Something was not quite right, though she could not yet put her finger on what troubled her. The kissing bough swayed gently overhead, casting dancing shadows on the faces below. In just a few moments, she would understand that those shadows were prophetic, and that someone in this festive gathering had already set in motion events that would indeed make this Christmas the first sad one in the long, peaceful history of St-Mary-Mead. Chapter 2. The Gramophone and a Cry. The toast was echoed throughout the hall with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Miss Marple sipped delicately at her glass of punch, noting the way certain faces had tightened at Moresby's peculiar words about honesty and fairness. Whatever undercurrents ran beneath the surface of this Christmas gathering, they were deeper than the usual village politics she'd grown accustomed to observing. Vivian Moresby had scarcely touched her lips to her glass before setting it down with a sharp click on the nearest table. Her husband's speech seemed to have affected her more than most, and Miss Marple observed the way her gloved hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her burgundy skirt. "Rather a serious tone for Christmas Day," murmured Lady Bantry, moving to stand beside Miss Marple's chair. "One might think Archbold was addressing a board meeting rather than a holiday celebration." Before Miss Marple could respond, Moresby continued his address, apparently oblivious to the discomfort he was creating among his audience. "I have here," he said, patting his jacket pocket, "a letter that I shall read after our feast. It concerns the proper stewardship of our Christmas fund, and I believe it will interest you all greatly." The gramophone continued its melodious accompaniment, though Miss Marple noticed that Beatrice Larkin had moved away from the machine and was now standing near the kitchen doors, her face pale beneath her carefully applied powder. Mr. Hargrave shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his earlier joviality replaced by something approaching apprehension. Only Nora Pike appeared entirely unaffected by Moresby's implications. She stood with military precision beside her donations table, her sharp eyes fixed on the speaker with what might have been approval. Miss Marple had long ago learned to distrust such displays of righteousness, particularly when they occurred in conjunction with mysterious letters and pointed remarks about honesty. The lights in the hall flickered suddenly, causing several people to glance upward at the electric fixtures. The flicker lasted only a moment, barely long enough to register, before the illumination steadied once more. But in that brief instant of uncertainty, several things happened almost simultaneously. There was a sharp crack from somewhere above, the sound of wood splitting or rope snapping under strain. The gramophone continued its cheerful melody, but the needle seemed to skip slightly, producing a discordant note that cut through the carol like a blade. And then, with a sound like thunder in a small space, the kissing bough fell. Miss Marple's trained eye caught the sequence of events with the clarity that had served her well in previous investigations. The heavy iron ring with its burden of holly and fruit, and the substantial brass candlestick at its center, swung down in a wide arc that would have been almost graceful if not for its terrible purpose. Archbold Moresby, standing directly beneath with his glass still raised in toast, had perhaps a second to register the descending shadow before the ring struck him with devastating force. The impact was sickening. The iron ring caught him across the temple and the back of his skull with a blow that sent him crashing to the floor among the scattered apples and lemons that had torn loose from the bough's decorations. His glass flew from nerveless fingers, sending a spray of punch across the polished boards, where it mingled with something darker that began to pool beneath his head. For a moment the hall was frozen in tableau. The gramophone played on, its cheerful notes now grotesquely inappropriate. The kissing bough lay twisted on the floor like a broken crown, its candle extinguished, and its holly scattered in all directions. And in the center of the devastation lay Archibald Moresby, motionless and silent. It was Vivian Moresby who broke the spell. Her scream when it came was brief and sharp, more of surprise than grief. She took a step toward her fallen husband, then seemed to think better of it, and remained where she stood, one hand pressed to her throat. "Good God!" exclaimed Dr. Haydock, pushing forward through the stunned crowd. The elderly physician, who had been enjoying a quiet conversation with Reverend Clement near the back of the hall, moved with practiced efficiency of one accustomed to emergencies. He knelt beside Moresby's fallen form, his hands moving quickly to check for signs of life. Miss Marple rose from her chair with deceptive calm, her knitting sliding to the floor unnoticed. Years of experience had taught her that the first moments after such an incident were crucial, not only for any hope of saving the victim, but for preserving the scene exactly as it had occurred. "Nobody move," she said quietly, but with such authority that the milling crowd froze in place. "Dr. Haydock, how is he?" The doctor's face, when he looked up, was grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." The blow was massive, concentrated across a wide area, like a heavy ring brought down in a full swing. He gestured toward the iron circle that lay beside the body. Death would have been instantaneous. Inspector Slack, who had been enjoying his Christmas dinner in the company of the village constable when word reached him, arrived with admirable speed. He was a thin, energetic man with a tendency toward hasty conclusions, but Miss Marple had learned to appreciate his thoroughness even when she disagreed with his methods. "Right then," he said briskly, surveying the scene with professional detachment. "Clear case of an accident, I'd say. Badly hung decoration, faulty rope, or fixings. These old beams can be treacherous when they're carrying weight they weren't designed for." Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes were already cataloging details that others might overlook. She moved closer to the body, careful not to disturb anything, and paused beside Moresby's fallen form. "Inspector," she said softly, "might I suggest you examine his clothing rather carefully, particularly the lapels?" Slack looked at her with the expression of a man who had learned to respect her observations despite his natural inclination to dismiss civilian interference. He knelt beside the body and peered closely at Moresby's dark jacket. "There's something here," he admitted after a moment. "White dust of some sort, very fine, like powder." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had noticed it immediately. A faint dusting across the dark wool that caught the light like chalk on a blackboard. But this was not ordinary dust, nor was it the kind of debris one might expect from a falling decoration. "Might I suggest, Inspector, that you also examine the edge of the table where Mr. Moresby was standing, just there, where the light catches it." Slack followed her gaze and found himself looking at a curved mark on the polished wood, as if something heavy and smooth had been pressed against the edge with considerable force. It was barely visible, but unmistakably there. While the inspector continued his examination, Miss Marple allowed her attention to wander to the gramophone, which someone had finally thought to silence. The record sat motionless on the turntable, and she observed that the tone arm bore a tiny scratch on its chrome surface, a cross-hatched mark that seemed oddly placed. "Most peculiar," she murmured to herself, but Lady Bantry, who had remained close by her side throughout the crisis, caught the words. "What's peculiar, Jane? Surely it's just a terrible accident. These old decorations hanging from those ancient beams." But Miss Marple was studying the beam itself now, her sharp eyes following the line from where the kissing bough's rope had been attached to the point directly above where Moresby had fallen. There was something not quite right about the geometry of the fall, something that suggested forces more complex than simple gravity and a failing support. Perhaps, she said quietly. But accidents, my dear Dolly, have a way of revealing themselves upon close examination, and sometimes what appears to be misfortune is actually something far more deliberate. Reverend Clement, who had been ministering to the shocked members of his congregation, approached with a grave demeanor appropriate to the circumstances. "A terrible tragedy," he said solemnly, "and on Christmas Day of all days. Poor Archbold. Whatever his faults, he didn't deserve such an end." Miss Marple looked at him sharply. "His faults, Vicar?" The Reverend colored slightly. "Oh, you know how it is in a small village. People talk. There had been some irregularities in the management of various committees. Nothing proven, of course, but Archbold could be rather high-handed in his methods." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, filing this information away for future consideration. She glanced once more at the scattered remains of the kissing bough, at the white dust on the dead man's lapel, at the suspicious mark on the gramophone's tone arm. No, she thought to herself, settling back into her chair to await the inspector's official conclusions. This was no accident, however much it might appear to be one. Someone in this festive gathering had planned Archbold Moresby's death with considerable care and ingenuity. The question now was not where the murder had been committed, but how it had been accomplished, and by whom. The first sad Christmas in St-Mary-Mead's history had indeed begun. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Whiting Dust. The parish hall had taken on the hushed quality that follows sudden death. Inspector Slack moved about his business with professional thoroughness, photographing the scene and making notes in his inevitable pocketbook, while Dr. Haydock supervised the careful removal of Archbold Moresby's body. The festive decorations seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion, their cheerful colors now appearing garish in the changed atmosphere. Miss Marple remained in her chair, apparently absorbed in retrieving her dropped knitting, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the activity around her. She had lived long enough to understand that the moments immediately following a death often revealed as much as hours of subsequent investigation, provided one knew what to look for. Lady Bantry had appointed herself as unofficial coordinator of comfort, moving among the shaken villagers with offers of tea and gentle words. But Miss Marple noticed that several members of the gathering seemed less shocked than might be expected. Beatrice Larkin, in particular, displayed a composure that bordered on the remarkable, efficiently tidying away the scattered paper chains as if nothing more significant than a minor domestic accident had occurred. "Terrible business," muttered Beale, the gardener who stood near the wall, wringing his cap in his work-roughened hands. "That rope looked sound enough when I tested it yesterday evening. Strong as any I've worked with. Can't understand how it came to fail like that." "Most puzzling," agreed Miss Marple. "I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual about the arrangement this morning when you adjusted the height?" Beale's weathered face creased in concentration. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something different about the way it hung. The balance seemed changed, like. When I first strung it up, the whole thing sat level and true. But this morning, when Mr. Moresby asked me to raise it those 2 finger breadths, it seemed to want to tip toward the iron ring." Inspector Slack, who had been examining the fallen kissing bough with a magnifying glass, looked up sharply. "Tip toward the ring, you say? That suggests the weight distribution was altered between yesterday and this morning." Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair and approached the inspector, her knitting tucked neatly under one arm. "If I might make an observation, Inspector, that white dust on the deceased's lapel is rather interesting." Slack frowned at the mention of the dust. "I've been wondering about that myself. It's not the sort of debris you'd expect from holly and ivy." "Indeed not," agreed Miss Marple. "It appears to be whiting, the powdered chalk used for cleaning glass and creating artificial snow effects. Quite distinctive in its texture and the way it clings to fabric." She moved toward the gallery that ran along one side of the hall, her keen eyes scanning the decorated balustrade. I believe you'll find that someone has been rather generous with the Christmas snow effects up there. See how it dusts the railings. The inspector followed her gaze and nodded grudgingly. You're right. But how would dust from the gallery end up on Moresby's clothing? He was standing well away from it when the bough fell. An excellent question, murmured Miss Marple. She approached the table, where Moresby had been standing for his toast and bent to examine its polished surface more closely. Inspector, would you be so kind as to bring your magnifying glass here? Under the enhanced scrutiny, the curved mark on the table's edge became more pronounced. It was a smooth depression, as if something heavy and round had been pressed against the wood with considerable force. Most illuminating, observed Miss Marple. The mark is precisely where Mr. Moresby was standing, and it appears to be fresh. The wood is slightly compressed, suggesting significant pressure was applied. She straightened and turned her attention to the gramophone, which sat silent on its nearby table. The machine was an expensive model, its mahogany case gleaming with care and attention. But it was the tone arm that drew her particular interest. How curious, she murmured, bending to examine the chrome-plated mechanism. There appears to be a small scratch here, cross-hatched, as if something rough had been tied to the arm and then pulled away suddenly. Beatrice Larkin, who had been sorting through the scattered decorations, looked up at these words. Tied to the tone arm? Whatever for? An excellent question, Mrs. Larkin, replied Miss Marple mildly, though I suspect the answer might be found among these paper chains. They're remarkably well constructed, aren't they? Much sturdier than the usual sort. She lifted one of the chain links and examined it carefully. The paper was indeed heavier than normal, and the construction showed unusual attention to detail, but one link in particular caught her attention. Unlike the others, it seemed slightly stiffer, as if something had been inserted within its folded layers. How interesting, she observed, holding the link up to the light. This one appears to contain something more substantial than paste and paper. With delicate fingers, she opened the link carefully. Inside, running the full length of the paper fold, was a length of fine white sewing thread. Its end had been finished with a neat knot, tied with the precision of someone accustomed to such work. Inspector Slack examined the thread with growing interest. That's a butcher's knot, if I'm not mistaken. Double loop, very secure. Not the sort of thing you'd expect to find in a paper decoration. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed not. And if you examine the kissing bow's suspension point carefully, I think you might find traces of similar thread. The inspector turned his attention to the tangled remains of the bow's hanging system. The main rope was indeed intact, as Beale had insisted, but there were additional elements that seemed to serve no decorative purpose. A small loop near the central candlestick showed signs of recent knotting, and caught in the twisted hemp were several white fibers that matched the thread from the paper chain. Most peculiar arrangement, muttered Slack, almost as if someone had rigged an additional support system. Or perhaps, suggested Miss Marple gently, a release mechanism. The thread running from the gramophone through the paper chain to some point above would create a rather ingenious timer, don't you think? Lady Bantry, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, approached the small group. Jane, surely you're not suggesting that someone deliberately caused the bough to fall? I'm suggesting nothing at present, replied Miss Marple with her customary caution, merely observing what the evidence reveals. Though I must say, the precision of the timing is rather remarkable. To have the bough fall at precisely the moment of the toast suggests either extraordinary coincidence or careful planning. She walked slowly around the scene, her eyes taking in details that others had overlooked. Near the base of the beam from which the kissing bough had hung, she paused to examine a small waxy pellet that had been overlooked in the general confusion. Inspector, you might want to preserve this, she said, indicating the tiny object. It appears to be sealing wax. the sort used for securing temporary attachments. As the full implications of Miss Marple's observations began to dawn on the assembled company, a new tension filled the hall. What had seemed like a tragic accident was revealing itself as something far more sinister. Someone among the Christmas celebrants had used considerable ingenuity to commit murder, employing the very symbols of the season as instruments of death. Vivian Moresby, who had maintained her composure throughout the initial shock, now appeared increasingly agitated. She stood apart from the others, her elegant gloves twisted between her fingers, watching the investigation with something that might have been fear. "This is preposterous," she said suddenly, her voice sharp with strain. "Archbold's death was clearly an accident. These wild theories about threads and timers are nothing but fantasy." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle sympathy. "Of course, this must be terribly distressing for you, my dear, but I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that your husband would be standing in precisely the right spot at precisely the right moment." The implications hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Christmas Day in St-Mary-Mead had indeed become the first sad one in the village's history, but not through any natural tragedy. It had been made so by human malice, carefully planned and expertly executed. Chapter 4: A Paper Chain with Thread. The discovery of the thread within the paper chain had transformed the atmosphere in the parish hall from one of shocked grief to something approaching dread. Inspector Slack methodically collected the evidence while the assembled villagers watched in fascinated horror as their Christmas celebration revealed itself to be the scene of a carefully orchestrated crime. Miss Marple continued her quiet examination of the decorations, her practiced eye seeking out anomalies that others might dismiss as insignificant. The paper chains that festooned the hall were indeed remarkably well constructed, far superior to the usual hasty productions of village committees. Each link had been cut with precision and joined with mathematical regularity, creating garlands that were both beautiful and functional. "Mrs. Larkin," she said conversationally, "these chains are quite exceptional. Did you make them all yourself?" Beatrice Larkin looked up from where she had been gathering scattered holly leaves, her face flushed with what might have been pride or embarrassment. "Oh yes, I always insist on doing the decorations properly. Can't abide shoddy work, especially for Christmas. Each chain took hours to complete, but I believe in maintaining standards." "Most commendable," murmured Miss Marple, following the line of one particular garland that stretched from the gramophone table toward the center of the hall. "And I see you've used the chains for more than mere decoration. This one appears to support part of the kissing bough arrangement." Indeed, closer examination revealed that several of the paper chains served structural as well as ornamental purposes. They were anchored to various points around the hall and converged near the beam from which the kissing bough had hung, creating a web of colorful supports that would have been nearly invisible to casual observation. "Lady Bantry," replied Miss Marple with a slight smile, "in my experience, the most effective crimes are often the most domestic. They employ familiar objects and exploit ordinary circumstances in extraordinary ways." She traced the path of the thread-containing chain with her finger, noting how it passed through several strategic points before disappearing into the general tangle of decorations near the ceiling. The engineering of it was quite remarkable, really. Someone had invested considerable time and thought into creating what appeared to be a simple holiday display, but was actually a sophisticated mechanism. Inspector Slack joined them, his notebook filled with observations and measurements. "I found more traces of that whiting dust near the beam," he reported, "and there are definitely signs that something was attached to the main support point temporarily. Small holes in the wood, recently made." "Fascinating," observed Miss Marple. "And the gramophone records? I noticed there were several on the shelf beside the machine." "2 copies of the same carol collection," Slack replied, consulting his notes. Mrs. Larkin says she keeps duplicates in case of breakage, but one of them shows unusual wear in the mind's run-out groove. Much deeper scoring than you'd expect from normal. Beatrice Larkin's color deepened at this revelation. I had to play that particular record several times to get the timing right for the ceremony, she explained quickly. The needle kept sticking, so I had to restart it repeatedly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. How troublesome for you. And yet the needle seemed to be working perfectly well when the tragedy occurred. Perhaps the problem was not with the machine itself, but with something attached to the tone arm. The silence that greeted this observation was profound. Miss Marple had a way of making such suggestions that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried deeper implications for those with guilty consciences. Reverend Clement, who had been quietly ministering to the more distressed members of his congregation, approached the investigating party. I hate to interrupt, he said gently, but I feel I should mention something that Archbold said to me earlier this week. He seemed quite agitated about some irregularities he discovered in the Christmas fund accounts. What sort of irregularities? Asked Inspector Slack sharply. Nothing specific, I'm afraid. But he mentioned something about donations being redirected and expenses being adjusted without proper authorization. He was planning to address the matter publicly, he said. Something about ensuring that Christmas remained honest and above board. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. That would explain the rather pointed nature of his toast, she observed. And the mysterious letter he mentioned. Vivian Moresby, who had been maintaining a strained silence, suddenly spoke up. Archbold was always finding fault with other people's efforts. He couldn't bear the thought that anyone else might receive credit for charitable work. If there were problems with the fund, it was probably his own meddling that caused them. The bitterness in her voice surprised everyone, including herself. She immediately looked stricken, as if she had revealed more than she intended. My dear Mrs. Moresby, said Miss Marple kindly, grief affects us all differently. Perhaps you would prefer to rest somewhere quiet while the inspector completes his investigation. No, Vivian replied firmly. I want to hear what happened. Archbold may have been difficult, but he deserved better than this. Miss Marple returned her attention to the paper chains, following their intricate patterns with growing understanding. The more she studied the arrangement, the more impressed she became with its creator's ingenuity. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, using the cheerful chaos of Christmas decorations to conceal a deadly purpose. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe you'll find that this particular chain serves as more than decoration. If my theory is correct, it functioned as a guide wire, allowing someone to control the release of the kissing bough from a considerable distance. She pointed to a section where the chain passed through a small metal eyelet that had been painted to match the beam. This would allow the thread to move freely while keeping it properly aligned. When the gramophone reached the end of its record, the tone arm would pull the thread, which would travel along this chain to the release point above. Beale, who had been listening with growing amazement, shook his head in wonder. That would take considerable knowledge of mechanics and timing. Not something you'd expect from your average villager. Perhaps not, agreed Miss Marple. But someone with experience in organizing complex events, someone accustomed to coordinating multiple elements to achieve a specific result at a precise moment, might find such a challenge quite within their capabilities. Her eyes settled on Beatrice Larkin with gentle speculation. The WI convener had gone very pale, her efficient composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Miss Marple's patient observation. Really, Miss Marple? Beatrice said with forced lightness. You make it sound as if organizing a church social requires the skills of an engineer. Not at all, replied Miss Marple serenely. But I have always found that people who excel at one type of organization often possess talents that transfer quite readily to other fields. The same attention to detail that creates beautiful paper chains might also devise more complex applications for similar materials. The web of evidence was tightening around the truth, drawn as precisely as the paper chains themselves. Someone in the hall had used their intimate knowledge of the Christmas preparations to create a murder weapon from the very symbols of joy and celebration. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple, who had seen how human nature could corrupt even the most innocent of occasions. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the first sad Christmas in St-Mary-Mead's history had been neither accident nor divine judgment, but the result of very human malice disguised as festive decoration. Chapter 5. 2 Records, 1 Needle Scar. Miss Marple's attention had become increasingly focused on the gramophone and its accompanying records. There was something about the mechanical precision of the crime that suggested an intimate familiarity with the equipment's capabilities. She approached the mahogany cabinet with the measured steps of someone who understood that the smallest details often held the greatest significance. The 2 records sat side by side on the shelf beneath the turntable, their black surfaces gleaming under the electric lights. At first glance, they appeared identical. The same manufacturer's label, the same cheerful collection of Christmas carols, even the same catalog number. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that apparent similarities often concealed crucial differences. "Inspector," she called softly, "might I trouble you for your magnifying glass once more?" Slack approached with the requested instrument, his expression showing a grudging respect for the elderly lady's observational skills. "What have you spotted now, Miss Marple?" "These records," she replied, lifting each disc carefully by its edges. Mrs. Larkin mentioned having to restart the music several times due to needle problems, but look here at the run-out grooves. Under magnification, the difference became immediately apparent. 1 record showed the normal wear patterns of moderate use, light scratches that followed the spiral of the groove in neat, regular lines. The 2nd record, however, displayed something quite different. Its run-out groove, the smooth area at the center where the needle comes to rest at the end of play, was scored with a deep, circular scratch that had been worn smooth by repeated traversal. "Extraordinary," murmured Inspector. Slack. "That's not normal wear. It's as if the needle was forced to track that area repeatedly under unusual pressure." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. And what might cause a needle to behave in such a manner? Perhaps if it were carrying an additional burden, a thread, for instance, that would create extra resistance when it reached the record's end." Lady Bantry, who had been following the technical discussion with some difficulty, looked puzzled. "But Jane, why would anyone want to make the needle stick at the end of a record?" "An excellent question, my dear. Consider the mechanics of what we've discovered. A thread runs from the gramophone through the paper chains to some form of release mechanism above. When the record finishes playing, the needle encounters increased resistance in that damaged groove. What happens to the tone arm?" "It would pull," said Dr. Haydock, who had returned from his medical duties and was following the investigation with professional interest. "The automatic mechanism tries to lift the needle, but if there's something attached to the arm, it would create tension along whatever line was connected to it." "Precisely," agreed Miss Marple. "A most ingenious timing device, far more reliable than any clock, because it depends on the fixed duration of the musical recording." Beatrice Larkin had grown very still during this exchange. Her usual bustling efficiency had deserted her, and she stood frozen beside the scattered remains of her carefully constructed decorations, like a general surveying a lost battlefield. "Mrs. Larkin," Miss Marple addressed her with gentle courtesy, "you mentioned having to restart this particular record several times. Might I ask when this difficulty first presented itself?" I'm not certain," Beatrice replied, her voice smaller than usual. "The past few days have been such a rush of preparations. One loses track of such minor details. Of course, Miss Marple agreed sympathetically, though I suspect the problem may have developed quite recently, perhaps even this morning, when you were making final adjustments to ensure everything would proceed smoothly for Mr. Moresby's speech. The silence that followed was profound. Even the whispered conversations that had been continuing among the other villagers ceased, as the implications of Miss Marple's gentle questioning became clear. Inspector Slack examined the second record more closely, holding it at various angles to catch the light. "This damage is definitely recent," he announced. "The groove walls are clean, not filled with the dust and debris you'd expect from older ones, and there are tiny metal filings embedded in the vinyl, consistent with a needle being forced to track the same area under abnormal conditions." Mr. Hargrave Graves, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the discovery of the murder plot, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "I don't like to speak ill of anyone," he began hesitantly, "but there's something I think you ought to know. Archbold came to see me yesterday evening after the shop closed. He was asking about the Christmas fund contributions, wanting to verify the amounts I donated." "And what did you tell him?" asked Miss Marple with interest. "The truth, of course. But he seemed to think the recorded amounts were different from what I had actually given, smaller somehow. And he mentioned that other people's contributions seemed to have been adjusted as well." Nora Pike, the postmistress, sniffed with disapproval. Archbold always was one to make accusations without proper evidence. Just because the bookkeeping wasn't to his exact specifications didn't mean anything untoward was happening. "Nevertheless," observed Miss Marple mildly, "it appears that Mr. Moresby had discovered some form of irregularity that he intended to address publicly. The letter he mentioned would presumably have contained details of his findings." Vivian Moresby looked up sharply at this reminder. "Archbold's letter. I'd forgotten about it in all the confusion. He said he was carrying it in his jacket pocket." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "I removed the contents of his clothing as part of the standard procedure. There was indeed an envelope, sealed, but addressed to the parish committee. I was planning to read it once the immediate investigation was complete." "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple, "the time has come to examine Mr. Moresby's final communication. It may shed considerable light on the motives behind this tragedy." As Slack retrieved the envelope from his evidence case, Miss Marple continued her study of the gramophone setup. The positioning of the machine relative to the kissing bow had clearly been planned with mathematical precision. The angle of the thread's path, the height of the release mechanism, even the weight distribution of the bow itself, all had been calculated to ensure that the deadly iron ring would swing in exactly the right arc to strike its intended victim. "Remarkable engineering," she murmured to herself. "Someone with considerable organizational skills and an intimate knowledge of mechanical principles, not to mention access to all the materials and the opportunity to install such an elaborate system without detection. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with inexorable logic. The damaged record that would provide the crucial timing, the thread hidden within the decorative paper chain, the carefully positioned gramophone, and the precisely hung kissing bow. All components of a murder method that was as ingenious as it was cold-blooded." As Inspector Slack prepared to read Archbold Moresby's final letter, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of the assembled suspects. Someone among them had planned this crime with meticulous attention to detail, using their knowledge of village routines and Christmas traditions to create what should have been the perfect murder. The only flaw in their plan, she reflected, had been underestimating the observational powers of a quiet elderly lady with a talent for noticing things that others overlooked. Chapter 6. The New Hook in the Beam. Inspector. Slack's examination of the ceiling beam revealed details that had escaped initial scrutiny. Armed with a stepladder borrowed from the church vestry, he was able to study the suspension point of the kissing bow with professional thoroughness. What he discovered confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the mechanical sophistication of the crime. There are 2 hooks up. Here, he called down to the assembled group. One old and tarnished, set well back in the wood, but there's a second one, much newer, positioned about 3 inches forward from the original. Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. And which hook was supporting the kissing bow when it fell, Inspector? The new one by the looks of it, Slack replied. Fresh brass, barely a day or 2 old, I'd say. Still has the shine you get from the ironmonger's shop. Lady Bantry looked up with mounting concern. But why would anyone install a new hook? The old one has supported Christmas decorations for decades without incident. An excellent question, murmured Miss Marple. Perhaps because the old hook was positioned too far back for the murderer's purposes. The precise placement of the bow would be crucial to ensure it struck the intended target. She directed her attention to Beale, who stood shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Mr. Beale, when you hung the kissing bow yesterday evening, which hook did you use? The old one, miss, same as always. But this morning, when Mr. Moresby asked me to adjust the height, he said to move it to the new hook. Said it would hang better for the ceremony. And did you question this instruction? Beale's weathered face colored slightly. Well, no, miss. Mr. Moresby was always very particular about having things just so. I thought perhaps he'd had the new hook installed to improve the appearance of the display. Inspector Slack continued his examination from atop the ladder. There's something else up here, he announced. A small hole in the beam, very recent by the look of it, about the right size for a thin nail or pin. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with understanding. Ah, yes, the release mechanism, a simple pin holding the critical element in place until the thread could be pulled to dislodge it. But I still don't understand how the whole contraption worked, protested Dr. Haydock. How could pulling a thread from the gramophone cause that heavy bow to fall with such precision? Miss Marple approached the scattered remains of the kissing bow, her keen eyes studying the suspension system that had been concealed within the festive decorations. The rope work was more complex than it had initially appeared, with several additional loops and knots that served no apparent decorative purpose. Inspector, would you examine this loop here? She requested, pointing to a section of cord near what had been the bow's center. I believe you'll find it's been retied quite recently, and with a very particular type of knot. Slack descended from his ladder and bent to examine the indicated cordage. You're right, he confirmed after a moment. This is a butcher's knot, same as the one we found in the paper chain. Double loop, very secure, but also very recognizable to anyone familiar with the technique. Miss Marple glanced meaningfully at Mr. Hargrave Graves, who stood nearby with an expression of growing alarm. Mr. Hargrave, as someone who works with rope and cord daily, I'm sure you recognize the craftsmanship. He replied reluctantly. That's a proper butcher's knot, no mistake. But I didn't tie it, Miss Marple. I'd swear to that on my mother's grave. Of course not, she agreed gently. But someone who had observed your work closely might have learned to replicate your technique. Someone who had access to your shop, perhaps, or who had watched you prepare packages over the years. The implications hung in the air like incense. Every member of the small community knew Hargrave's distinctive knotwork, and several of them had reason to be familiar with his methods. Beatrice Larkin stepped forward with obvious reluctance. If you must know, she said stiffly, I asked Edgar, Mr. Hargrave, to show me his knot technique several months ago. The WI was planning a demonstration on traditional crafts, and I wanted to ensure we presented the information accurately. How thoughtful of you, observed Miss Marple. And did you find the butcher's knot difficult to master? Not particularly. It's simply a matter of understanding the principle and practicing the motions until they become automatic. Inspector. Slack had returned to his examination of the ceiling, this time focusing on the area immediately around the hooks. "There's a patch of that white dust up here as well," he reported, "and what looks like a small smear of wax, as if something had been temporarily fixed in place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The wax would serve to hold a pin or small lever in the precise position required. Once the thread pulled it free, the mechanism would activate and the bow would fall. She walked slowly around the scene, her mind reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to Archibald Moresby's death. The precision required was remarkable. Every element had to be positioned exactly, every timing calculated to the second. "The engineering is quite sophisticated," she mused aloud. The killer needed to understand not only the mechanical principles involved, but also the precise duration of the gramophone record. They would have had to test the system repeatedly to ensure perfect timing. Lady Bantry shivered despite the warmth of the hall. "It's so cold-blooded, Jane, to plan someone's death with such methodical precision." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple sadly. "And yet there's something almost desperate about the elaborateness of the scheme." Someone who felt cornered, perhaps, with no other way to prevent a public exposure of their misdeeds. Reverend Clement approached with a grave demeanor that befitted the circumstances. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about what Archibald said regarding the Christmas fund. If there were indeed irregularities, they would represent a serious breach of trust. The fund supports several of our most vulnerable parishioners." "Quite so, Vicar," Miss Marple replied. "And the prospect of public disgrace might drive someone to extreme measures, particularly if they had convinced themselves that their actions were somehow justified." Miss Marple's gaze swept the assembled suspects, noting the varying degrees of tension and anxiety displayed on their faces. Someone among them had committed the perfect crime, or so they had believed. The tragic irony was that their very perfectionism had created the evidence that would ultimately expose them. The new hook gleaming in the ancient beam, the precisely knotted cords, the damaged gramophone record, the thread concealed within the paper chains, each element had been planned with meticulous care. But in their attention to mechanical detail, the murderer had overlooked the human element. The quiet observation of an elderly lady who understood that the most domestic crimes often revealed the darkest secrets of the human heart. As Inspector Slack prepared to read Archibald Moresby's final letter, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the bitter irony that Christmas, the season of peace and goodwill, had been perverted into an instrument of vengeance and death. Chapter 7. A Letter About the First Sad Christmas. Inspector Slack handled the sealed envelope with a reverence due to what might prove to be a dead man's final testament. The parish hall had grown unnaturally quiet as the assembled villagers waited to learn what revelations Archibald Moresby had intended to share with them. Even the children, who had been playing in the adjoining room, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and had fallen silent. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the inspector as he read and the faces of those who might be affected by the letter's contents. Years of experience had taught her that initial reactions often revealed more than subsequent explanations, and she was prepared to catch every nuance of expression. The envelope itself bore Moresby's characteristic precise handwriting. "To be read after the Christmas toast, that we may never have the first sad Christmas in history." The irony of those words, given the circumstances, was not lost on anyone present. Slack carefully slit the envelope and extracted several sheets of typescript along with what appeared to be a handwritten list. His expression grew increasingly grim as he scanned the contents. "Well, Inspector?" prompted Dr. Haydock after a moment of tense silence. "It's a detailed accounting of irregularities in the Christmas fund," Slack replied solemnly. "Names, dates, amounts. Moresby appears to have conducted quite a thorough investigation." He cleared his throat and began to read selected passages. "It is with great reluctance that I bring these matters to public attention, but my duty to this community requires nothing less than complete honesty. Over the past 18 months, I've discovered systematic discrepancies in the management of our charitable fund." Vivian Moresby sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her face drained of color. "Oh, Archbold," she whispered, "you always did have to be the moral authority for everyone else." The inspector continued, "Donations have been recorded at amounts lower than those actually given, with the differences apparently redirected to unauthorized purposes. Expenses have been inflated or entirely fabricated. Most troubling of all, goods intended for the poor have been diverted for personal use." A collective gasp arose from the assembled villagers. Such accusations, if proven, would rock the foundations of their small community's trust. "He named specific individuals," Slack continued, his voice growing heavier. "Hargrave and Beale are mentioned, but with asterisks indicating they received goods outside the established rules." Mr. Hargrave stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "That's a damned lie. I donated half the roast for today's feast. I've never taken so much as a penny from any church fund." "Nor I," added Beale with quiet dignity. "All I ever got was permission to take some of the old flowers from the altar for my compost heap. Nothing that weren't meant for the dustbin anyway." Miss Marple studied the handwritten list that accompanied the typescript. "Inspector, might I examine that additional document? The handwriting appears to be different from the main letter." Slack passed her the list, and Miss Marple held it up to the light with careful attention. The names and amounts were indeed typed on what appeared to be official WI letterhead, but the asterisks beside Hargrave's and Beale's names had been added later in a different hand entirely. "How interesting," she murmured. "The original list contains no accusations against these two gentlemen. The asterisks and their implications were added subsequently by someone else." Beatrice Larkin had gone very pale, her usual composure finally beginning to crack under the mounting evidence. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," she said, but her voice lacked its customary authority. "I'm suggesting nothing at present," replied Miss Marple gently, "merely observing that this list was typed on Women's Institute letterhead, which suggests it originated from someone with access to that organization's supplies. The asterisks, however, were clearly added later, presumably to direct suspicion toward innocent parties. Nora." Pike stepped forward with the determined stride of one accustomed to official duties. "If there have been irregularities in the fund management, they should be investigated properly through the appropriate channels. These wild accusations being thrown about will help no one." "On the contrary," observed Miss Marple, "I believe they help us understand the motive for this terrible crime. Someone knew that Mr. Moresby had uncovered their deceptions and was prepared to expose them publicly. The prospect of disgrace and possible criminal charges might well drive a person to desperate measures." Inspector Slack returned to the letter, scanning the remaining paragraphs. "There's more here about the methods used. Apparently, small amounts were consistently skimmed from donations, and invoices were submitted for supplies that were never actually purchased. The total involved is substantial, nearly $50 over 18 months, a sum that represented several months' wages for most of the villagers," Miss Marple reflected. "Certainly enough to justify the elaborate precautions taken by the embezzler." Lady Bantry looked around the group with growing distress. "But who could have done such a thing? We all trusted each other completely." "Trust," observed Miss Marple sadly, "is often the embezzler's greatest asset. Someone in a position of authority, someone trusted with keys and access to funds, someone whose word would not ordinarily be questioned. She approached the gramophone table where the evidence of the mechanical murder weapon was still visible. The scratched tone arm, the damaged record, the carefully positioned machine, all bore testimony to a mind that planned with methodical precision. The same attention to detail that made the embezzlement possible also made this elaborate murder scheme feasible, she continued. Someone who could manipulate financial records with such skill would certainly be capable of devising a mechanical timer using gramophone equipment. Beatrice Larkin suddenly straightened, some of her old defiance returning. These accusations are preposterous. I've devoted years of my life to charitable work in this community. To suggest that I would steal from the poor is both insulting and absurd. No one has suggested anything of the kind, replied Miss Marple with her characteristic mildness. Though I notice you seem to have assumed the accusations were directed at you. The silence that followed was profound. Even the ticking of the parish hall's ancient clock seemed to have grown louder, marking the seconds with inexorable precision. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat uncomfortably. If these financial irregularities are accurate, they represent a serious criminal matter. But surely that doesn't justify this. He gestured toward the spot where Moresby's body had lain. Indeed not, agreed Miss Marple. Though I suspect the murderer had convinced themselves that they were somehow protecting the community from scandal. Perhaps they believed that removing Mr. Moresby would allow them to quietly rectify the situation without public exposure. She picked up one of the paper chains that had been so carefully constructed to conceal the murder mechanism. The workmanship was indeed exceptional. Each link perfectly formed and precisely joined, the same. Perfectionism that had made the embezzlement difficult to detect had ultimately led to its exposure through an overly elaborate murder scheme, she reflected aloud. The irony is that Mr. Moresby's death has brought far more attention to these irregularities than his planned speech ever would have. A public accusation might have been challenged or dismissed. A murder investigation, however, ensures that every detail will be examined with microscopic thoroughness. Inspector Slack folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. I'll need to verify these financial claims. Of course, but combined with the physical evidence of the murder method, they provide a clear picture of both motive and opportunity. The first sad Christmas in St-Mary-Mead's, history was revealing itself to be even more tragic than anyone had initially imagined. Not merely a crime of passion or sudden violence, but a calculated betrayal of community trust that had culminated in the coldest form of premeditated murder. Chapter 8. Books, Donations, and Alibis. Nora Pike's offer to produce the official cash book was accepted with alacrity by Inspector Slack, who recognized the importance of corroborating Moresby's written accusations with hard evidence. The Yar postmistress unlocked her donations table with the same methodical precision she brought to her postal duties, extracting a leather-bound ledger that had clearly seen considerable use over the past months. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the book's contents and the reactions of those present, as the financial irregularities were laid bare. The truth she had learned often revealed itself not only in documents but in the subtle changes of expression that accompanied their examination. The entries are quite clear, Nora announced with grim satisfaction. Each donation recorded, each expenditure noted, though I must say some of the amounts seemed rather modest given what I knew certain individuals had contributed. Inspector Slack studied the ledger carefully, comparing the recorded figures with the amounts listed in Moresby's letter. There's a consistent pattern here. Donations rounded down to the nearest pound, sometimes by quite substantial amounts. A £5 note becomes $4, 7 shillings becomes 6. "And where," asked Dr. Haydock pointedly, "did the surplus amounts disappear to?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Miss Marple noticed that Beatrice Larkin had moved close to the kitchen doors, as if preparing for a strategic retreat should the need arise. "If I might examine the expenditure entries," Miss Marple suggested gently. "I suspect they may prove equally illuminating. Indeed, the expense records revealed a pattern of creative accounting that would have impressed a professional auditor. Bills for supplies that seemed remarkably expensive, payments to vendors whose names appeared nowhere else in village records, and a series of cash disbursements that defied detailed explanation." Vivian Moresby had been studying the proceedings, with a detached air of one whose worst fears had been confirmed. "Archbold." "Suspected something months ago," she said quietly. "He kept asking me about household expenses, wondering if I thought the parish was paying too much for various items. I thought he was simply being his usual penny-pinching self." "When did he begin his investigation in earnest?" inquired Miss Marple. "About 6 weeks ago, I'd say. He started staying late at the parish office, going through old records and comparing invoices with actual deliveries. He even visited several of the suppliers personally to verify their billing." Inspector Slack looked up from the ledger with increasing concern. "Mrs. Larkin, as treasurer of the fund, you would have been responsible for most of these entries." Beatrice drew herself up with what remained of her dignity. "I performed my duties exactly as the committee instructed. If there were errors in recording, they were certainly not deliberate." "Of course not," agreed Miss Marple soothingly. "Though I wonder if you might help us understand the sequence of events this morning. Your whereabouts during the crucial period could help establish the timeline." The request for alibis sent a visible tremor through the assembled company. What had begun as a tragic accident was now unmistakably a murder investigation, with each person's movements subject to scrutiny. Vivian Moresby spoke first, her voice steady despite the strain. "I was attending to the fairy lights near the entrance. The electrical connections were unreliable, and I spent considerable time at the plug board trying to prevent them from flickering." "And you remained in that area throughout your husband's speech?" asked Inspector Slack. "Yes, until I heard the crash. The wiring required constant attention, and I was afraid we might lose all the decorative lighting if I abandoned my post." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The fairy lights had indeed been troublesome, she recalled, though their brief flicker just before the tragedy now seemed ominously significant. Beatrice Larkin's account came next, delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to organizational responsibilities. "I was stationed beside the gramophone. Naturally, it was my duty to ensure the musical accompaniment proceeded smoothly. I remained there throughout the toast, ready to adjust the volume or change records if necessary." "A most convenient position," observed Miss Marple mildly. "You would have had an excellent view of the entire proceedings from there." Mr. Hargrave shifted uncomfortably before offering his alibi. "I was tending the roast in the kitchen. The joint was at a critical stage, and I couldn't afford to leave it unattended. Ask anyone who knows cooking. You don't abandon a 15-pound roast during the final browning." Dr. Haydock nodded confirmation. "I can vouch for that. I visited the kitchen briefly during the speech, and Hargrave was indeed focused entirely on his cooking duties. Beale's account was characteristically modest. I was in the vestibule, mist, checking on the outer decorations. The wind had been playing havoc with the wreaths on the doors, and I wanted to ensure nothing came loose during the ceremony." "Yet you were able to respond very quickly when the accident occurred," observed Inspector Slack. "Sound carries well in these old buildings. Inspector, the crash was loud enough to wake the dead, if you'll pardon the expression." Miss Marple found herself studying the physical layout of the hall with renewed interest. From Beatrice's position at the gramophone, one would indeed have an unobstructed view of both the kissing bough and Moresby's location beneath it. More importantly, the gramophone controls would allow precise timing of any mechanism connected to the turntable's operation. "Mrs. Larkin," she said conversationally, "when you mentioned having to restart the record several times, was this during the actual ceremony or during your earlier preparations?" "During preparations, naturally," Beatrice replied quickly. "I would never have interrupted Mr. Moresby's speech with such technical difficulties." "Of course not, though I imagine you must have become quite familiar with the precise duration of the recording through these repeated playings." The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Anyone who had played the same record multiple times would know exactly when it would reach its conclusion, providing perfect timing for any mechanism that depended on the gramophone's automatic functions. Inspector Slack returned to the cash book, his finger tracing the columns of figures with growing understanding. The pattern becomes clearer the more one examines it. Small amounts diverted consistently over many months, creating a substantial sum without any single theft being large enough to attract immediate attention. "A technique," added Miss Marple, "that requires considerable organizational skill and access to the original donation records. Someone would need to know the actual amounts given in order to record lesser sums convincingly." Lady Bantry, who had been following the financial revelations with increasing dismay, shook her head sadly. "To think that someone we trusted could betray the community in such a calculated manner, and then to commit murder to avoid exposure." "The murder troubles me most," confessed Dr. Haydock. "The financial irregularities, while serious, might have been resolved through restitution and discretion, but taking a human life crosses a line that can never be uncrossed." "Indeed, Doctor," Miss Marple nodded gravely, "though I suspect the murderer convinced themselves that they were somehow protecting the community from scandal. Perhaps they believed that Mr. Moresby's public accusations would damage the village's reputation irreparably." She moved once again to examine the scattered remains of the kissing bough, her sharp eyes cataloging the evidence that told the story of premeditated murder. The precision of the mechanism, the careful timing, the elaborate misdirection, all spoke of someone who planned with meticulous attention to detail. The tragic irony, she reflected, is that the very skills that made the embezzlement successful also ensured that the murder would ultimately be detected. The same methodical approach that allowed small thefts to go unnoticed created a murder weapon so sophisticated that it proclaimed the killer's identity to anyone who understood the evidence. The net was closing inexorably around the truth, drawn tight by the accumulated weight of financial records, physical evidence, and human psychology. Someone in the parish hall had committed the perfect crime, or so they had believed. But perfection, Miss Marple knew, was often the enemy of concealment. Chapter 9, A. Butcher's Knot and the Candlesticks, Miss. Marple's request for a demonstration of knot-tying technique might have seemed eccentric under ordinary circumstances, but the assembled company had grown accustomed to her methodical approach to investigation. Mr. Hargrave, though clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, obliged her request with the practiced movements of one whose livelihood depended on secure packaging. "Just as you would tie a parcel in your shop," Miss Marple encouraged gently, producing a length of cord from her knitting bag. "Nothing elaborate, simply your customary method." Hargrave took the cord with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. His movements were swift and sure, the result of decades of repetition. Loop, twist, pull through, and tighten. The sequence produced a neat double knot that would hold against considerable strain while remaining relatively easy to untie when necessary. "There," he said, holding up the finished work. "Standard butcher's knot. Same as I've tied thousands of times." Miss Marple examined the knot with her magnifying glass, comparing it to the similar fastening they had discovered in the kissing bough's cordage. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same proportions, the same crossing pattern, The same professional competence. Quite identical, she observed with satisfaction. Inspector, I believe this confirms that whoever rigged the kissing bow's release mechanism had either learned Mr. Hargrave's technique or was attempting to implicate him through the use of his distinctive knot. Work. Beatrice Larkin stepped forward with apparent reluctance. As I mentioned earlier, I did ask Edgar, Mr. Hargrave, to demonstrate his knot-tying methods for our WI presentation. It seemed important to preserve traditional skills. Most commendable, agreed Miss Marple. And did you find the technique difficult to master? Not particularly. Like any skill, it simply requires understanding the principle and practicing until the movements become automatic. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then turned her attention to the gramophone once more. The chrome tone arm bore its telltale scratch, the physical evidence of something having been attached and then forcibly removed. She bent closer to examine the mechanism, her sharp eyes catching details that others might overlook. Inspector, if you would be so kind as to bring your magnifying glass. I believe there are some fibers caught on the tone arm that might prove illuminating. Slack approached with the requested instrument, and together they examined the gramophone's delicate mechanism caught on a tiny protrusion. Where the chrome met the pivot point were several white threads, so fine as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Cotton sewing thread, Miss Marple announced with quiet satisfaction. The same type used in the paper chain construction. This would have provided the connection between the gramophone's timing mechanism and the release system above, and she straightened and moved to examine the central candlestick that had fallen with the kissing bow. The brass fixture was heavier than its decorative appearance suggested, and when she lifted it carefully, something rattled inside. Weighted, she observed, shaking the candlestick gently. There appears to be something additional inside, presumably to ensure the proper balance of the entire arrangement. Dr. Haydock approached with professional curiosity. May I examine that, Miss Marple? I have some experience with the physics of falling objects. He took the candlestick and hefted it experimentally. Definitely weighted. I'd estimate there's at least a pound of lead shot or similar material inside. Combined with the iron ring, this would have created a devastating impact when it fell from that height. The precision is remarkable, observed Miss Marple. The weight distribution, the angle of fall, the timing mechanism, every element calculated to ensure a fatal result. Lady Bantry shivered at the clinical description. It's so calculating, Jane, to plan someone's death with such mechanical precision. Indeed, agreed Miss Marple sadly, though I suspect the murderer convinced themselves that they were somehow justified in their actions. Perhaps they believed that Mr. Moresby's planned exposure would cause more harm than his death. Inspector Slack had been examining the physical evidence with growing understanding of the murder method. The sequence becomes clear when you understand the mechanism, he said grimly. The thread connected the gramophone tone arm to a small pin or lever above. When the record finished playing, the automatic arm movement would pull the thread, dislodging the pin and causing the kissing bow to swing down in a deadly arc. But how could anyone predict with such precision where Mr. Moresby would be standing? Asked Reverend Clement. Miss Marple smiled grimly. Because they controlled both the timing and the positioning. Mr. Moresby's speech was planned in advance. The gramophone's location was predetermined, and the kissing bow was positioned exactly above the spot where he traditionally stood for such ceremonies. She paused to examine the scattered decorations once more, her keen eyes cataloging the evidence of careful preparation. The murderer had this advantage of intimate knowledge. They knew the village customs, the hall's layout, and Mr. Moresby's predictable habits. Miss Marple demonstrated once again how the recapping tool could be used to create this deception. noting how the technique required familiarity with dairy equipment that only someone with regular access to such tools would possess. Beneath the bottle, she continued, moving to the trestle where the churn had been positioned. The upper wheel chock was supported, not by its usual secure placement, but by sugar cubes strategically positioned to dissolve when exposed to liquid. As milk dripped slowly from the punctured bottle above, these supports gradually weakened until they could no longer bear the weight of the chock. The mechanical precision of the murder weapon was evident, as Miss Marple traced the path the wooden block would have followed once its supports failed. When the sugar finally gave way, the chock slipped along a track made slippery by the dissolving sweetener, releasing the full weight of the 10-gallon churn to roll down the ramp at precisely the moment when Ben Larch would be conducting his morning inspection. Inspector Slack cleared his throat officiously. "That's all very well, Miss Marple, but proving how the crime was committed is only half the battle. We need to establish who had the means, motive, and opportunity to construct such a device." "Indeed we do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Let us examine each of these elements systematically. First, the means. This crime required access to dairy equipment, including the recapping tool necessary to create the double foil seal. It also required sugar cubes of the specific type used in commercial tea. Service wrapped in blue paper rather than the plain brown strips used by the dairy itself." She turned to address Violet Tanner directly. "Mrs. Tanner, you borrowed the recapping tool yesterday, ostensibly to repair some bottle caps for a window display. You also purchased sugar cubes from Mr. Sykes's grocery yesterday evening, an unusual time for such a purchase, according to his testimony." Violet's composure cracked slightly under Miss Marple's calm scrutiny. "I needed the sugar for this morning's service," she said stiffly. "There's nothing suspicious about purchasing supplies for one's business." "Nothing suspicious in itself," Miss Marple agreed. "But when combined with other evidence, it forms part of a damning pattern. You see, the motive for this crime lay in the systematic fraud you had been perpetrating against Meadow Dairy." The explanation that followed laid bare the extent of Violet Tanner's deception. The watering down of milk, the addition of sugar to mask the dilution, the corruption of May Reed to falsify lactometer readings, all had been part of an elaborate scheme to defraud the dairy while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business. "Ben Larch had discovered your activities," Miss Marple continued remorselessly. "His notebook contains evidence of his suspicions, and May Reed has confirmed that he intended to confront you this morning about the thin cream returns. Exposure would have meant not only the end of your fraudulent scheme, but likely criminal charges and the ruin of your tea-room business." Henry Larch listened to this exposition with growing anger and grief. "You killed my son to protect your miserable little swindle," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Violet's mask of composure finally slipped entirely. "I never meant for anyone to die," she said desperately. "I only intended to delay him, to give myself time to speak with you privately about the situation. The mechanism was supposed to create a minor accident that would prevent Ben from making his rounds this morning, but you positioned the timing device to strike at the exact moment of Ben's morning inspection," Miss Marple pointed out with inexorable logic. "You knew his routines because you had observed them during your visits to the dairy. You calculated the timing to ensure the churn would fall when he was standing in precisely the right position to be struck." The confession, when it came, was delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. Violet Tanner admitted to constructing the murder weapon, to setting it in motion during her early morning visit to receive cake deliveries, and to establishing her alibi by ensuring she was seen unlocking her tea room at the crucial time. "The alibi was carefully constructed," Miss Marple observed. "You needed to be seen at your own establishment during the crucial period, but you also needed time to set the mechanism in motion. By claiming an early delivery that never actually materialized, you created a legitimate reason to be up and about, while also providing yourself with the opportunity to visit the dairy unobserved, Inspector. Slack stepped forward with the grim satisfaction of a man whose case had been thoroughly proven. Violet Tanner, I arrest you for the willful murder of Benjamin Larch. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you. As the formalities of arrest proceeded, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the domestic nature of the crime. The killer had used the most innocent of materials, milk, sugar, and the familiar tools of dairy work, to create a weapon of lethal precision. It was a reminder that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary facades, using the comfortable routines of village life to mask the darkest of intentions. Later, as the dairy yard began to empty and the machinery of justice took its course, Lady Bantry stood beside the quiet loading ramp where the tragedy had unfolded. Milk and sugar, she mused. Who would have thought such innocent things could be turned to murder? Miss Marple folded her knitting with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served. It is the domestic things. My dear Dolly, she replied thoughtfully. Milk rings on slate, sugar wrappers in bottle crates, and the way a foil cap is pressed. Those small details don't lie, even when people do. The truth has a way of revealing itself through the most ordinary of evidence, if one simply knows how to look. The morning that had begun with such terrible tragedy was ending with the satisfaction of mystery solved and justice served. Ben Larch's murder had been avenged, and the dairy that bore his family's name could begin the slow process of healing from the betrayal that had cost a young man his life.